The smell of our emotions. Can humans emit pheromones to communicate how we feel? Tune in to find out, only here on the People Scientist podcast. You are listening to The People Scientist, the podcast dedicated to helping us optimize our health with the latest scientific findings on neuroscience, physiology, and nutrition. I, your host, Dr. Stephanie Caligiuri, a nutritionist, physiologist, and neuroscientist, will be here with you every single week, bringing us information to ignite our thinking, to help us be one step closer to the healthiest we can be. Hello, my People Scientist Army, and welcome back to the People Scientist podcast for episode 110, where every week I arm us with some scientific information so we can all be a little bit smarter and healthier with every episode. How are you doing right now? I hope that you're doing okay, and thank you for letting me be a part of your day. I hope in today's episode I can share some intriguing and new scientific information with you that'll leave you with something to think about. So, what are we talking about today? Well, I started by coming across an interesting study that gave insight into humans having a back and forth conversation by studying songbirds and how they communicate. But then that led me down a rabbit hole of how humans communicate. Then I grew interested in how we communicate nonverbally, like through our facial expressions or body language, for example. Then I came across how humans may be able to communicate through chemosignals, meaning an odor that we may give off that is not even obvious to someone, but somehow this chemosignal is being detected and can have an impact on our brain activity and our communication between one another. You may be more familiar with the term pheromones, as pheromones can be chemosignals that are emitted between animals, but in humans, pheromones are called chemosignals. So are you ready for this interesting and very different episode? I think you'll find it entertaining because I sure did. I burst out laughing reading through some of these studies, and I hope that you find it entertaining too. So without further ado, let's start off, as we always do, with some core takeaways. Scientists have thought that we as humans communicate primarily through our sense of vision and our sense of hearing. But in recent years, scientists have collected data to support that, like animals, humans can emit chemosignals, popularly known as pheromones. For a long time, scientists were skeptical that humans could emit these odors in order to communicate to others, but the data supports that this may be true. We as humans can produce chemicals in our sweat when we feel emotions like happiness, arousal, fear, and disgust. In clinical trials, when people are given specific human sweat samples to smell, participants would react in a predictable manner, liking or disliking the smell. Like if the sweat sample was produced when someone was scared, the person smelling the sweat was likely to show signs of increased alertness and more sensitivity to scary imagery. Men found female sweat to be more pleasant when the sweat came from women who were aroused, and the scent of men may also increase how attractive women perceive them. So maybe this data speaks to how we can feel tension in a room or how someone's scent can add to us being more attracted to them. So the nose knows. Interesting, isn't it? Now, let's get into the details. We are appreciating that communication can be beyond words and body language. We as humans can emit certain molecules in our sweat that may be detected by others around us. In animals, these molecules emitted that can be smelled are called pheromones, but in humans, we like to call them chemosignals. Chemosignals can be transmitted through body odors, and they may play a role in the communication in humans and even humans and other species like dogs and cats. Oftentimes in clinical trials, participants didn't even notice a scent per se, but the chemosignals could still result in a physiological response like increased alertness, hair standing on end, and increased sensitivity to emotions. So this communication of chemosignals might be subconscious and something that we aren't even aware of. Now, our ability to smell serves so many fundamental purposes. We know that smell interacts with taste in order to alter our appetite and how we perceive food. Have you ever gotten a cold and lost your ability to smell? How was your appetite? Probably impaired, right? Smell can also impact how we see things, like how a meal looks and smells. If we smell red wine but expecting white wine, this can cause some disagreement in our senses. If someone is wearing a pleasant perfume or cologne, this may alter how we perceive them. Also, really importantly, our sense of smell is strongly connected to our memory. And I go into details on that specific topic back in episode 73, titled, Can We Smell Our Way to Better Memory? For example, in clinical trials, using familiar odors can help trigger memories and may be a useful strategy to help increase cognition in patients with dementia. So if that interests you, head back to episode 73 and give that one a listen. Now, Calvi published last year in the journal Brain and Behavior a review on how our emotions can have a scent. Yep, you heard me right. Our emotions can have a scent. For so long, we thought that humans communicated primarily through talking, writing, body language, and sounds. Because our visual cortex of our brain became quite developed through evolution, while our olfactory system responsible for smelling may have regressed through evolution. However, in the last several years, scientists have grown to appreciate that, like other animals, humans can communicate through scent and odor as well. Camilo Glue in the journal Chemical Senses in 2018 had individuals view photos of different facial expressions like disgust, fear, anger, and a neutral facial expression. But before viewing these images, the participants were provided sweat samples to smell. Now, the sweat samples either came from people that reported feeling intense fear from watching horror videos or from watching neutral videos. It turns out that when the participants smelled the sweat of people that felt fear, that it made these participants' emotions more intense when viewing images of faces with different expressions. So the authors concluded that in the sweat of humans who are feeling fear, that there could be a chemosignal being emitted that can increase us feeling alert, aware, and more sensitive to emotions around us. If we think about it, that makes sense. Fear exists to protect us from danger, so our response of being able to detect fear from others, and that resulting in us being more alert of what is around us, seems like an appropriate response. Iverson in the journal Neuroplasticity in 2015 conducted an interesting study that recruited 14 individuals born blind and 14 individuals that were aged and gender matched but had full vision. Their hypothesis was that individuals born with congenital blindness would have a heightened sense of smell versus people born with full vision. So the scientists had a separate group of individuals watch a series of movies that induced different emotions, such as amusement, fear, disgust, or even sexual arousal. The scientists collected sweat from the participants while watching these movies by using cotton pads under their arms. Then these sweat samples, as well as a control solution with no sweat, were randomly provided to the 28 individuals that were either visually impaired or with full vision. And the participants were asked to determine what emotion they felt or sensed when smelling the samples. Interestingly, in this study, and as seen in many clinical trials, disgust was the most obvious to detect from the sweat samples. 60% of the time, the participants with visual impairment could detect disgust from smelling the sweat of those feeling disgust. That's pretty remarkable, isn't it? For the emotion fear, they were able to detect it 40% of the time. By comparison, individuals with full vision were less accurate. They could detect disgust and fear 10 and 35% of the time. Intriguingly, both groups were able to detect happiness or arousal about 25% of the time. So the scent of negative emotion seemed to be more profound. It is not entirely certain what is present in our sweat that is being detected by others. That is still an ongoing area of research. but something is being emitted from our body odor when we are feeling fear or disgust or happiness or arousal that might be able to be picked up by others. This makes sense, like if you ever have entered into a room where everyone is feeling tense or stressed, like before an exam or after hearing some bad news. For me, in those situations, I can sense that emotion almost immediately upon entering the room. And I'm sure my ability to sense that emotion comes from a variety of inputs, like my eyes seeing the stress in people, my ears hearing the chatter. But I'm curious if our noses can also sense the stress signals being emitted from people's bodies in that room, so to speak. I bet you it does. Okay, so as I was reading, I came across this study, and for some reason, I found it so funny. And I don't mean to poke fun at the study, but I burst out laughing in the lab when I read it. In the journal eLife, Fruman and colleagues published in 2015 how a handshake can be a way that humans may transfer chemosignals to one another. What the scientists did was they sat at the top of a room and they watched people at a convention. They looked at people and compared those who shook hands with others versus those who did not shake hands. And the scientists monitored to see what the two different types of people would do. They noticed that those who shook hands with others were more likely to sniff their hands. And they found this hilarious. Like, I just imagined after these individuals shook hands with someone, like them bringing their hand up to their nose and going, like what were they observing? I don't know. But the scientists think that subconsciously humans might do this, probably more of like a passing quick sniff, I'm assuming, but that they might do that in order to sense the chemosignal subconsciously that was transferred to their hand by another individual. Is that really true? I don't know, but it's a funny and interesting hypothesis nonetheless. Now, moving on, I digress from that funny study. Pren Christensen in the journal PLOS One in 2009 conducted a clinical trial where they were able to induce empathy in people by smelling anxiety from others. You might be wondering, how did the scientists do that? Well, they recruited 49 people. They collected the sweat of these 49 people during two different tasks. From number one, awaiting an exam, which was thought to be a stressful and anxious event for them because their stress hormone cortisol level rose. And the control event, the second event, was during them just playing a sport where their cortisol levels did not rise. Now, these sweat samples were then provided to 14 new people while they had their brain activity scanned using functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. Now, interesting to note was that the scent of the sweat was very low and actually undetectable by half of the participants, suggesting that our brain may perceive and be influenced by a chemosignal without us even being aware of a scent. The scientists concluded that the sweat from the stressful exam led these participants to have brain regions recruited that are involved in emotional stimuli, like the fusiform gyrus. They also felt empathy and had brain regions like the insula and precuneus cingulate cortex being recruited. And those smelling the sweat of those that were stressed also had increased attention and brain regions like the thalamus and prefrontal cortex being recruited. So we may be able to relay our emotions to others, like our feelings of stress or anxiety, via our scent. And this could potentially lead to empathy or others feeling the same. Interestingly, scientists have realized through many clinical trials that women seem to be more sensitive to chemosignals than men. It is also clear that chemosignals from individuals of the opposite gender are more effective and powerful than those from the same gender. So women perceive the scent of men more accurately, and men of women. Martins in 2005 concluded that therefore chemosignals likely serve an evolutionary purpose in finding a mate or for reproduction. Wiseman and Shira in the journal Archives of Sexual Behavior last year conducted a clinical trial where they took sweat samples from women when they were aroused and when they were not. So how did they do that, you might ask? Well, they had 11 heterosexual young women join the study. The scientists had the women refrain from using perfume, deodorants, or eating strong foods for days prior. When they arrived for the study, they cleaned their underarms with unscented wipes. then had cotton pads placed under their arms. The women were to cycle on a stationary bike for 3 minutes, then they watched a neutral video about a bridge building, or on another day watched a movie that would have them become aroused. And this movie apparently was called 9 Songs. I haven't seen it. The women were asked to rate how they felt when watching the two different movies and how aroused they felt. The cotton pads were then taken and provided to 24 heterosexual men. The men were asked to rate how attractive they found the scents and how intensely they felt about it. And what do you know? The men did indeed rate the scent of women when they were aroused as more attractive and pleasant versus when the women watched the neutral videos. The scientists note that, importantly, the scent emitted from women being in their fertile phase of their cycle can be distinct from them when they are aroused. For example, increased fertility can be associated with elevated levels of progesterone, luteinizing hormone, whereas arousal can be accompanied by short-term changes in hormones such as testosterone. So I bring up testosterone. Can we smell or sense testosterone? Possibly. Testosterone is converted to an odorous compound called androstenedione. Both women and men can emit this molecule, but men naturally emit far more, as they tend to have more testosterone. Scientists believe that men and women emit a compound produced from testosterone, like I said, androstenedione, and that's known to modulate mood, induce a feeling of dominance, and may make us feel more alert. Saxton in the journal Hormones and Behavior in 2008 studied the influence of this compound, commonly emitted in the sweat of men and sometimes women, on how attractive women perceived men to be. So the scientists tested the effects of this compound at a speed dating event in which men and women interacted in a series of brief encounters. So women either smelled this metabolite of testosterone or clove oil or water prior to the dating event. Now, men were rated about 19% more attractive when assessed by women who had been exposed to the testosterone metabolite versus water. So the scientists suggested that this testosterone metabolite, androstenedione, a common compound to be emitted from men's sweat, can influence women's attraction to men when interacting with them for the first time. So what is the neuroscience behind this potential response? Well, Zhu and Chen in the Journal of Neuroscience in 2008 reported specific brain responses when people smelled the sweat of individuals who were sexually aroused, known to contain this metabolite of testosterone. Now, using fMRI while smelling this sweat, many brain regions were recruited that are involved in us being more alert and open to receiving more information, like the orbital frontal cortex, the right fusiform cortex, and the right hypothalamus. This indicated that the particular chemosensory compound that is in this sweat can be encoded holistically in the brain, involving many different brain regions. So that is it, my People Scientist Army, a fun and interesting episode on how we as humans do indeed emit molecules called chemosignals that can be picked up by others using our sense of smell, called our olfaction system. Clinical trials indicate that we may be able to perceive others' emotions without even realizing the presence of the scent. And it appears that we are more likely to empathize and be influenced by negative chemosignals of disgust and fear versus more positive moods like happiness and arousal. Men and women may emit a compound that is produced from testosterone that may influence how attractive we find someone or how pleasant we perceive the scent. So we can communicate to others how we are feeling just beyond our words and actions, but also through the compounds we emit in our body odor. Cool, isn't it? Now, if you want to see some of the studies I cite in each episode, then make sure to follow me on social media, because that is where I post the abstracts of the most important papers that I cite in the episode. If you have the choice of social media platform, I use Instagram the most. If you by chance want to buy me a coffee to say thank you for the episode, then the information for Venmo and Patreon are available in the description box below. I hope that you all have an awesome week, and I look forward to meeting you all back here for another episode at the same time and same place. Bye for now. I am a scientist simply sharing scientific evidence. Some of the clinical interventions I discuss are not appropriate for everyone. Before making any changes to your diet or lifestyle, please do consult the advice of your physician or dietitian. My opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of Mount Sinai Hospital and its affiliates.